Elden Ring must have a fabulous story for us to discover. This is what I have been believing since the day the game was announced. Isn't this evident? The most prominent game director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, paired with the most prominent fantasy writer, George R.R. Martin, how could anyone expect any less? When the game was released in 2022, Elden Ring beat all my expectations. It easily became my favorite game of all time. The world is huge, absolutely gorgeous. The art design is superb. The enemies are tough, fair. You have various options for your waifu. The item descriptions contain valuable information, and the NPC are talking riddles that I did not understand. In fact, it almost completely destroyed my gaming experience, in that for a long time I could not bear playing another game. They are all tarnished. Before Elden Ring, I was entirely fascinated, and I started to learn the lore after my first blind playthrough, which took me over 160 hours. Previously, I played Dark Souls 1 and 3. I watched Vadi's videos about the lore, but I was never into it, never studied it. Elden Ring is clearly different for me because of the involvement of Martin, so I started to carefully watch lore and related videos from myriad of YouTubers, Smotown, Vadi Vadia, Zully the Witch, Wellag, Ratatasker, Crunchy, Ziastorm, Bonfire VN, Hawkshaw, The Tarnished Archaeologist, Cosmos, Kite Tales, Mad Luigi, Last Protagonist, and so on. At first, I took their words as facts, canons embedded in the in-game texts. However, gradually, I started to notice certain inconsistencies between different lore hunters' narratives. Then I realized that they may intermingle their own speculations with hard facts. Sometimes they make it clear that certain part of their narrative is speculation, but sometimes they don't. In order to distinguish speculation from hard facts, I need to get all the in-game texts into one place. So I learned how to unpack the game, locate the relevant folder for texts, wrote Python scripts to put all item descriptions into one Excel. Then I got all dialogue files, and I wrote Python scripts to analyze the dialogue logic files, the ESD files, and pinpointed the trigger for every single line of NPC dialogues. I thought this would be enough to understand the story, with the help of lore hunters. Then came the news that certain part of the English translation was done very poorly, especially Ranni's ending dialogue. I learned that although Martin helped set the mythos of Elden Ring, item descriptions, dialogues were ultimately written by Miyazaki in Japanese and translated into English by Frog Nation. For a game with so scarce texts, every single word might be important to decode the lore, and we all know that subtle meanings of words can be lost, and errors are almost inevitable during the process of translation. To glimpse into the intent of the director, there is no better way than to read the original Japanese texts. That is why I spent over a year learning Japanese by myself. Now that I can understand Japanese, I'd like to say that if one really wants to dig into the lore, Japanese is a must. In many occasions, there are ambiguities in English while there is none in Japanese. In a few cases, the English translation is plainly wrong. Here's one example that I haven't seen anyone bring up. The official English translation of the Light of Miquella incantation reads, Miquella sought to accept all that was and would be, but found one that refused to be embraced. No wonder, as one god and one king consort is all the world needs. This is confusing and is frankly a mistranslation. The Japanese version, if faithfully translated, should read, Miquella sought to accept and embrace everything, but he knew there is one thing he could not do. An absolute God and his Lord shall never stand on equal footing or stand with equal power. This explains why Miquella needs a puppet Radon, even if he could quit charming others by breaking his great rune. By the time I could read the Japanese texts without much difficulty, I thought I could piece together the whole picture. Unfortunately, however, this was never the case.
You are maidenless.
At every critical point of the lore, there is an open dead end, collapsed bridge that leads nowhere. Regarding these points, pretty much every lore hunter resorts to wild speculation, supported with practically zero evidence. I started to think that maybe Miyazaki cut too much information from the story, to the point that it is not possible for the player to get the full picture. but I was still quite hopeful that the DLC Shadow of the Erdtree may address these mysteries and give us a full picture. But now, 1 month after the release of the DLC, I have to say my hope is gone, and I believe it's time to say the following. Elden Ring does not have a central storyline, and I seriously speculate the following. Miyazaki-san does not have a central storyline in his head. In order to explain this blasphemous comment, we need to review the open dead ends in Elden Ring's lore. The story of Elden Ring is clearly different from the majority of games. In a usual game, the story is in the game itself, from the start of the game to the end. The backstory is either non-existent or is not important, weighs no more than 10% of the total story. Even if you miss the entire backstory, you still have a very good understanding of the story, simply because that is what you played through. Elden Ring is completely on the opposite end of the spectrum. The in-game story is not important. All major events have already occurred long before the Chosen Tarnished arrived at the lands between. He is only there to put an end to a dying age. In fact, the Chosen Tarnished did not come to the lands between of his own volition. He is already dead well before the game starts, beckoned here by the long-lost Grace.
Oh, rise now, ye tarnished, ye dead, who yet live.
It does not have a purpose of his own. His purpose is spelt out by a dead maiden. The fundamental questions are, who are we? Why are we here? What happened to the world? Unfortunately, to these fundamental questions we never got a full logical answer. The question, what happened to the world, is easier to investigate. The world is in a stifling stasis because Marika shattered the Elden Ring, and her demigod children, under the influence of the mad taint of their great runes, began warring with each other, known as the Shattering War, in which no lord arose. Why did Marika shatter the Elden Ring? We are told that the catalyst is the Night of the Black Knives, in which an Empyrean, Ranni, stole a fragment of destined death and slayed many of Marika's children, including Godwyn the Golden. The story trailer says the event drove Marika to the brink, and Rogier refers it as a catalyst for the shattering of the Elden Ring. But doesn't it sound like an overreach? How did the death of her children drive Marika, the one true god, to shatter the Elden Ring, the metaphysical power that dwells within her, the very symbol of the Golden Order? Do the two events have direct logic connection? I do not think so. On the other hand, a god shattering the very power she holds is a highly unusual event. In a full story, such an event requires a well-posited explanation, which unfortunately is non-existent in the game. We arrived at a major, open dead end. Second question, who are the Tarnished? When Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, finished his last conquering war, felling the last worthy foe, suddenly, at the third church of Marika, she robbed the grace of him and his kinfolk, banished them away from the lands between. Let them wage war, live and die. Thus they became the Tarnished. At the Church of Pilgrimage, she says,
Then, after thy death, I will give back what I once claimed, return to the lands between, wage war, and brandish the Elden Ring, grow strong in the face of death. Warriors of my lord, Lord Godfrey.
Does this make any sense? Considering that the banishment long predates the Night of the Black Knives, the shattering of the Elden Ring, the Shattering War, and the return of the Tarnished, she seems to have a ridiculously long plan. That plan directly affects the fate and purpose of the Chosen Tarnished, yet this act seems to admit zero justification in game. We arrived at another major open dead end. Third question, why are we here? We are here because at the end of the Shattering War, no lord arose. The demigods were abandoned by the greater will, so grace was extended to us Tarnished. What is grace? Melina tells us, it is the light of the Erdtree, just symbol of the Golden Order. Some Tarnished have a finger maiden with, e.g. Vike, Bernal, it is suggested that the chosen tarnished should have a finger maiden as well. The finger maidens serve the two fingers, vassals of the greater will. Rani, Enia, Vare, Patches all say or suggest that the tarnished are guided by the two fingers by default. It seems that the greater will or the two fingers beckoned us to the lands between. However, Marika is clearly at odds with the greater will and the Golden Order, as she shattered the Elden Ring and is being crucified. On the other hand, the tarnished are part of Marika's plan. If they are Marika's tools, then why would the greater will want to use the tarnished? Isn't that super dangerous? After all, in the end, we killed the Elden Beast, living incarnation of the Golden Order. Another mystery. It is not clear who is behind the force that beckoned us to the lands between. If we are to investigate the intention of Marika, more and more open dead ends appear. What did Master Hugh do to invoke the sheer terror of her? Why does Marika want a weapon that could slay a god? What does the word god here refer to? Marika herself? Radagon? The Elden Beast? Or the greater will? No explanation. When we fight Gideon, he says, Marika wants us to struggle unto eternity. Why? Gideon's armor set says he shuddered in fear when he glimpsed into Marika's will, and the end that should not be. This is the closest point we get to understand Marika's intention. Yet Miyazaki just stops here and gives us nothing. Let us investigate Marika's history and see if we could peep into her intention. Why did she tell her children to become a lord or a god, and tell them they will be abandoned if they fail to become aught? Going further back, there are multiple pieces of evidence suggesting that the Erdtree has been burnt before, and its current form is largely illusional, not corporeal. This is undoubtedly a major historical event. However, we have no information of who plotted it, how it happened, and more importantly, what impact it had on Marika's psyche. Melina being burnt and bodiless might be related to this event, but Miyazaki never hinted on why. Going even further back, who is the glow-eyed queen that Malekith, Shadow of Marika, defeated? Who did Marika seduce, and how did she betray to become a god? What on earth is this thing in the trailer? What is Godfrey's role before and during her ascension to godhood? How did the two fingers guide her? By this point, we still do not know the answer to the fundamental question, why is the chosen tarnished here? We investigated the history of Marika and the world. We investigated NPC's dialogues. But every direction we go, we end up on a collapsed bridge, leading nowhere. We are not asking for every detail about peripheral things. We are investigating the central plot. Without understanding which, the story is meaningless. In fact, it is not only the central plot. Almost every direction of research ends with a collapsed bridge. Why is Melina burnt and bodiless? Why is the complete lack of history about our fair maiden? What does it mean for her to appear in the Lord of Frenzied Flame ending, with her left eye unsealed? What is the nature of Torrent? Considering there are horse specimens in the storehouse that resemble Torrent, is he always spectral or he became spectral after Miquella abandoned him? Why is there no trace of Torrent's history in the lands between and in the realm of shadow? Radagon's red hair is said to be a curse of the giants. What happened between Radagon and the giants? Why does Ranni have a spectral face? Why is Ranni's spectral face identical to Melina's face? Who is Renna? Is she Ranni's sister, Ranni's secret Snow Witch mentor, or someone else? Why are there giant skulls and skeletons in the mountaintops in Sealed? If they belong to ancient giants, then wouldn't the lands between be too small to accommodate them? What is the nature of the Elden Ring symbol in Malekith Boss Arena, Fara Mazula? It has been emphasized many times that in the prehistorical era of dragons, there was no Erdtree. Then what does the root-like motif represent? Who is the statue girl below the Elden Ring symbol? Hyetta mentions that all that there is came from the One Great, and that the Great Will made a mistake. What is the nature of the One Great? What is the relation between the Greater Will with the One Great? What is the nature of the Greater Will's mistake? What is the nature of the three fingers? What is the relation between the two fingers and the three fingers? Were they parts of the same body, say, 5 fingers eons ago? The remembrance of the Impaler refers to Marika's original sin, and Ymir's dialogue also refers to Marika's sin. What on earth is this Marika's sin? Where is the realm of shadow physically? There is no satisfactory result to fit the DLC map into the base map, yet the suppressing pillar claims to be the very center of the lands between. What is the nature of the shadow tree? What does it mean for it to be the shadow of the Erdtree? What does it mean to be born of dark thoughts that bear no sense of order? Were they the same tree a long time ago? Why does the Land of Shadow incantation bear the sigil of ancient Erdtree? What caused the shadow tree to crumble from its core? What is the nature of the crucible? It has been emphasized many times that the crucible is the primordial form of the Erdtree. What and where is this primordial form of the Erdtree? As demonstrated above, in almost every direction you research into the lore, you inevitably come to a collapsed bridge, where either you stop or you have to resort to wild speculation. Even the central storyline is a big mystery. Miyazaki created many mini-stories, made effort to connect them on the surface, but he was not able to create a full and coherent picture. That is why he used mysteries after mystery. In so many cases, he is indicating that something important is here, but he just stops right there, provides nothing, and lets you guess. For example, he mentions that Gideon glimpsed into Marika's will, but he just won't go one step further to explain why Marika wants us to struggle unto eternity. Why? I bet Miyazaki himself does not have an answer. He just randomly inserts a twist and has no further canon in his head. Let me address a key issue. When Miyazaki was young, he was an avid reader. He would often go to local libraries, borrowing fantasy books, including those written in English, reached passages of text that he could not understand, and he used his imagination to fill the gaps. This experience has huge influence on Miyazaki's style of making video game. He would provide as few texts as possible, and leave many details and environment elements. These are all well known, and I am of course aware of them. I absolutely love this storytelling technique. Some stories do emerge gradually if one carefully read the item description. Here is one excellent example that happened to me. I first got the Fire Knight Hild ashes from the loft of the Shadow Keep. Its description reads, Hild was a dear friend to Salsa the Sage and joined those who urged that the specimens be preserved. I wondered, who is Salsa? Then I went back to the Sunken Church district, defeated this guy, and he dropped the Death Mask helm, which names the NPC as Wago. And I say to myself, oh, this guy is called Wago. Then finally I went to the bridge behind the Shadow Keep that led to the ancient ruins of Raoul, defeated this guy, and he dropped Salsa's hood, whose description reads, a disciple of the elder Wago, he refused to burn down an old ruin, the risk of his own life. All of a sudden, the circle is complete, the fog dissipates, and we know all that we need. This is the power of scattered information. I loathe so many modern AAA games, which would cram unending dialogues, cutscenes after cutscenes, and excessive details on quests while the story itself is mediocre at best. In various interviews, Miyazaki encouraged players to use their imagination on his games. Many players, including me, would think that all mysteries in his games are intentional and there is a canon to be reconstructed. However, I gradually changed my mind, and now I believe there is no canon whatsoever, at least for Elden Ring. I always believe that a great work warrants academic study. This has always been the case. Scholars study literatures all over the world. But what is a great work? I am not pretending to be a literary critique, but I believe that a strong plot is a basic for a work to be considered great. A work can be abstract as hell, but the events should be logically connected, and they form a coherent full story. A great story is like the map of Dark Souls 1, where you explore a large new area, randomly open a door, and suddenly you find yourself in an area you have visited before. This interconnectedness shows that the map is one whole, not a pile of scattered places. This criterion is actually well summarized by two items in Elden Ring: law of causality and law of regression. Law of causality is that which links all things in a chain of relation. Law of regression is that all things yearn eternally to converge. Ironically, Elden Ring's lore fails this basic criterion miserably. It does create many small pieces of stories, but they do not mingle harmoniously together. The lore is like a tree without a trunk, only branches. The branches are floating in the air. Sometimes two branches do touch, but most times when you walk on a branch, it inevitably leads to an open dead end. Without a trunk, almost every branch has to end with a mystery. And there is no way to assemble these branches to a whole tree. Sure, these small stories are interesting in their own right. Like most of Smotown's lore videos are over 1 hour long, and we can talk about the romance between R'hllana and Messmer's 18-inch snakes, but they are still local stories that fail to form a global story. Therefore, there is an essential difference between Elden Ring's lore and the fantasy novels Miyazaki read. The fantasy novels have a global story, it has one or more central plots, and the central plots ultimately conflate to one overarching plot, i.e., law of regression. That Miyazaki could not understand some parts of it was purely due to his lack of knowledge in a foreign language in his young age, not due to the work itself. A brilliant man as he is, it must be an easy job to pick up English as he may have already done, and if he wants to know what really happened in a fantasy book, parts he filled with imagination, it'd simply read the book again to get the canon. Whereas in Elden Ring, for the open dead ends, there is no canon whatsoever. I learned Japanese and investigated the game again, and although the Japanese texts are clearer than the English translation, most mysteries still remain mystery. There is a major consequence for the story building. When a writer has a global picture, his story is coherent. A big story, of course, has many side stories, just as a tree has many branches. However, because of the author's panorama, these side stories blend harmoniously, creating no logical or literary contradiction, i.e., law of causality. In a coherent story, there are natural restrictions on characters' actions and the flow of events. There should never be a plot twist for the sake of plot twist. Every plot twist should have a well-posited explanation. However, if a writer starts from many pieces of local stories without a predetermined global story in mind, it is extremely difficult to merge them into one story without creating subtle contradictions and blank plot twists. Unfortunately, in Elden Ring, such defects abound. Marika suddenly banished her consort after he helped conquer the lands between. Gideon, one who has long been aspiring to be an Elden Lord, suddenly uses all his might to prevent us from reaching the Elden Throne, because he glimpsed into an unspecified will of Marika. There are also many subtle contradictions in Elden Ring, which we will talk about later. Elden Ring's lore thus does not permit academic study. Academic study uses textual analysis, forensic analysis, logical deductions. Educated guesses need to be accompanied with multiple supporting evidence. With so many collapsed bridges in Elden Ring, there is no way to reassemble the pieces into a coherent story. My favorite lore hunter, the Tarnished Archaeologist, could go 1 or 2 steps further using academic analysis. For example, he is the one, as far as I know, that first proposed that the Erdtree has been burned before, and the current form is illusional rather than corporeal. He listed some strong evidence. The comparison of the ashes in Leyndell before and after we burn the Erdtree, the sealing of windows and doors in Leyndell with wax, Bach's expression of joy and awe when he sees the Erdtree in Leyndell.
My lord, did you see it? The Erdtree. I don't really have the words for this, but I was so dazzled. I felt something stir in my breast.
Enya and the finger reader crone at the Grand Lift of Rold, stressing that burning of the Erdtree is the first cardinal sin. Painting in the volcano manner depicting the Erdtree burning. This is what I call an academic analysis. Alas, even the Tarnished Archaeologist could not establish a full picture. Unlike academic study, wild speculation or a theory, on the other hand, aims to provide explanations, can join things without creating obvious contradictions, but oftentimes it lacks supporting evidence. Due to the lack of textual information in Elden Ring, when interpreting graphic assets, there are two easy pitfalls: apophenia and pareidolia. Apophenia means to perceive meaningful relation between unrelated things. Pareidolia means to enforce meaning to a thing when there is no intended meaning at all. We have seen lore hunters give interpretation to third-party general graphic assets used in Elden Ring, give important meanings on stone reliefs that cannot be clearly discerned, and link things that are not even remotely similar, like linking the dragon image on the Haligdrake talisman to the map of the lands between. For these reasons, I distinguish speculations from academic analysis. On the other hand, since Miyazaki started with local stories and tried to force them together, subtle contradictions are inevitably created. That is why many lore videos, some of which are quite logically sound, have content that directly or indirectly contradicts in-game text. If you collect all in-game texts into one place like me, it is easier to spot subtle contradictions in lore videos. Elden Ring's lack of central plot is quite baffling if one thinks about it. Indeed, to initialize a literary work, a writer usually first constructs a broad central plot, and then fills in the details and side stories. This is the natural thing to do. I do not know a famous story where the writer first starts from a lot of mini-stories and then tries to merge them together. So what could cause the sheer murkiness of Elden Ring's central plot? Here's my speculation. There are two factors: Miyazaki's game direction style and his treatment of Martin's work. Miyazaki's game direction style is called total direction, which means he has full control of all texts, names, story and lore, map and level design, and other aspects. Also, he takes full responsibility for the quality of his games. I will not detail Miyazaki's direction style, and I highly recommend DondonRV's fantastic 12-hour video, The Making of Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree, which I will link below in the comment section. The other factor is how Miyazaki handles Martin's work. As Martin said in an interview, he provided a fairly detailed background story, the history of Elden Ring, 5,000 years ago from the present day, and Miyazaki took the story, expanded it with his own vision, and wrote the history up to when the game starts.
My work on it was actually done years ago. These games, they're like movies. They take a long time to develop. Basically, they wanted a world created to set the game in. They wanted world building as a big factor in fantasy and science fiction. You're not only talking about the characters and the plot, but the setting is almost as important as everything else. Tolkien's Middle-earth, Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age, the Foundation universe of Isaac Asimov. I worked up fairly detailed background for them, and then they took it from there. So it's been several years since I've last seen them.
The process was better explained in a January 2022 GameInformer interview, which I will link below. And I believe it is key to understand how the big problem arose. Miyazaki says, and I quote, "When Martin wrote these characters and when he provided that origin story, that mythos for the world of Elden Ring, these demigods were much closer to their original form, and maybe closer to human form back then, before the shattering, before it all started. So it was more up to us to interpret this and say, how did they become such inhuman monsters? And how did the mad taint of the shattered shards of the Elden Ring and its power affect them? So that was our job, to take these grand heroes and sort of misshape them and distort them into something they were not. And I think if we get a chance to show Martin, and if he gets a chance to see the game and see these characters, I think he might be a bit shocked. When he wrote them, he was really envisioning something a little bit more human, a little bit more traditional human drama and fantasy characters. That process of taking these very human characters with flaws, but these very dramatic, heroic characters, and basically breaking them and making them these misshapen, grotesque monsters, that was a lot of fun for me personally. Therefore, Martin's story must have ended no later than the shattering of the Elden Ring. More importantly, Miyazaki shares a quite different vision for the story. He took Martin's mythos, reconstructed it with his own vision. It is not a big leap to say that he not only misshaped the characters but also misshaped the Martin story. This is what caused the big problem. As I have said before, in a coherent story, there are natural restrictions on characters' actions and the flow of events. Just like you cannot expect Rani to suddenly talk like Raya. When Miyazaki misshaped Martin's story, according to his vision, he needed to change the course of some characters and some historical events. Changing the course of one event may require changing many related events. And if that is not done carefully, inconsistencies, unnaturalness easily appear. Also, since Miyazaki shared a quite different vision for the story, he needed to bend Martin's track rather sharply. However, if he uses too much force, the track would simply snap. Just like in real-life train track, if you snap a track and make a 90-degree turn, the train will surely derail. Also, when Miyazaki continued the history where Martin left, he needed to follow the bent track and add a ton of his own elements. Concepts, stories, characters, aims. This is yet another daunting task to make everything coherent. To make a story out of another, add all your stuff and still make it coherent and deep, requires a lot of literary expertise, especially when you're working on a story by a prominent writer, because the interconnectedness of such a story may be much more intricate. To make a story out of another, with quite a different theme, is even harder. It's quite unimaginable to make a comedy sequel to the 2019 film Joker. Similarly, it's hard to take a story of flawed yet still heroic characters and make almost everyone into mad, severely weakened, grotesque monsters. I believe Miyazaki does not have such literary expertise. I believe this is the fundamental reason why Elden Ring's lore failed. Miyazaki's total direction style worsens the problem. Since Elden Ring is much larger than his previous games, he has 11 assisting directors who take responsibilities of various aspects like gameplay, level design, character design, etc. However, everything must pass his approval. Moreover, there is no assisting director for the story. Miyazaki is the one who built and controlled the in-game story. Specifically, for texts, despite the larger volume compared to previous games, he made sure that he goes through all of it, and he personally wrote a considerable portion of it. The lack of input from others deepened Elden Ring's lore failure. I believe that many mysteries in Elden Ring were actually well explained in Martin's story. However, Miyazaki forcibly used them for a different event, which would snap the natural literary track. In order to hide this unnaturalness, he has to hide a large portion of Martin's story, thus creating mysteries. For example, I believe, in Martin's story, there was a good reason that Marika banished Godfrey if that did occur in Martin's story at all. However, Miyazaki used this event for the creation of the Tarnished, and the initiation of Marika's super-long Tarnished plan. The event that followed deviated sharply from Martin's story, so any true reason, any event that led to Godfrey's banishment in Martin's story has to be hidden, because they do not fit into Miyazaki's story. Also, I believe in Martin's story, the Night of the Black Knives was merely one in a chain of events that naturally led to Marika's shattering of the Elden Ring. However, such chain of events would be too far from Miyazaki's vision, and he could not bend it to fit into his narrative. So again, he conveniently consigned most events and most details to oblivion. Think about it. We have vaguely conflicting information about Marika's role in that fateful night. Do you believe Martin could allow such murkiness? Ironically, the failure of Elden Ring's lore is aptly summarized by a dialogue in the game, as Ymir says,
I fear that you have borne witness to the whole of it. The conceits, the hypocrisy of the world built upon the Erdtree. The follies of men. Their bitter suffering. Is there no hope for redemption? The answer, sadly, is clear. There never was any hope. They were each of them defective, unhinged from the start. Marika herself, and the fingers that guided her. And this is what troubles me. No matter our efforts, if the roots are rotten, then we have little recourse.
After Shadow of the Erdtree is released, Miyazaki's lack of story planning became even more manifest. The DLC tries to touch on some unanswered questions, but it feels detached. What do I mean? The central story in the DLC is around Miquella, who charmed Radon's weakened soul and revived it in Mohg's body. I have no grudge with the story itself. However, just as many players pointed out, Miquella's desire for Radon is not hinted anywhere in the base game. No NPC mentions it, no item description mentions it, no environmental element hints it. Freya, a knight of Radon, knew the existence of such a vow, although she did not know the detail. Would Jaren, the guest commander of Radon, not know it as well? When Malenia marched on Caelid, would Radon's army not even know what she's here for? However, when Jaren painted the full picture for us, he never mentioned Malenia's purpose. That is what I call logical disconnection. On the other hand, there are strong evidence in the base game that shows Mohg willfully abducted Miquella, not doing so under his charm. In the DLC, it is clearly shown that Miquella had brutally used Mohg. Strictly speaking, Miquella's story does not logically contradict the base game, but in order to make it logically coherent, one has to add some winding argument. For example, Mohg's abduction was merely a show, or Miquella saw his abductor's ability and decided to use him. This feels contrived. To summarize, Miquella's story feels like a separate story, forcibly squeezed into the base story, creating logical disharmony. The feeling of logical disconnection or logical disharmony is prevalent in the DLC. The Realm of Shadow is very difficult to access to. Even a powerful Empyrean like Miquella needs to use Mohg's body to gain access to it. On the other hand, Mesmer could recognize the player as a tarnished on the first look, and he knows Marika's intention to sanction a new lord. Moreover, Death Knights quested to find their master Godwyn's split cadaver. Therefore, the veiling of the Realm of Shadow should occur in the late stage of the Age of the Erdtree. Yet in the base game, there is zero information regarding important characters like Mesmer, R'hllana, and the events that occurred in the Realm of Shadow. Again, it's not necessarily contradicting the base game, but this feels odd and logically disconnected. There is no new dialogue from NPCs in the base game. Even Gideon the All-Knowing, who strives to accumulate knowledge, has no new comment on the Realm of Shadow. We provided him information in the base game about Miquella, and he was quite excited to learn. Now we go to the Realm of Shadow, collect much more information about Miquella. He's now reticent. Logical disconnection. Considering Marika had a lot of history in the Realm of Shadow, shouldn't there be tons of spoken echoes of Marika that Malenia could share with us? Shouldn't she say something about her elder brother Mesmer, who harbors a same kindling as her? Yet, there is no new dialogue from Malenia. Logical disconnection. In the base game, living jars serve as carriers of the dead, with an Erdtree symbol on their lid. They mostly appear nearby minor Erdtrees and underground catacombs. However, in the DLC, living jars are the result of utterly cruel ritual experiments by the Hornsent that turned all Marika's kinfolk into disfigured freaks. The purposes of jars in the base game and the DLC are thus quite distant. What is the literary connection between the jars from the base game and the DLC? Moreover, if the jar experiments were so traumatizing that Marika sent Mesmer to almost completely wipe out the Hornsent clan, and that she veiled the Shadowland to erase the history of her fear and sin, then why would she even allow the practice of making living jars her very haunting nightmare in the lands between? Miyazaki clearly tried to answer some questions from the base game. However, he must have felt the difficulty to provide a self-contained answer, without creating even more mysteries. He wanted to touch on Torrent's history by showing the steed in the promotional poster, mounted by Miquella, yet ultimately no history of Torrent made to the DLC. We never know why Torrent, a mere steed, could see the lordship quality in the chosen tarnished. Miyazaki also tried to touch on the story of the gloam-eyed queen, but ultimately the only residual textual information about her is in the putrescent knight, whose internal model name is Knight of the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Since it is only in game files, It is no canon whatsoever. He did provide some history of Marika. Again, most information is shrouded in mysteries. Like we mentioned before, we do not know what this thing is. We do not know her seduction and betrayal. There seems to be no trace of Godfrey in the realm of shadow, etc. In the DLC, the word Numen is never mentioned. Instead, a new concept called shaman is created. Given that Marika is both a Numen and a shaman, do the two words mean the same thing, or are they different concepts? For all these reasons, the DLC story is connected to the base game, but only superficially. It does not integrate with the base game. It should be better treated as a separate story. So Miyazaki-san, I beg of thee, consider this. Before you create your next game, could you please first create a full picture of the story, the central story, the trunk of a tree that connects all branches. Again, I emphasize I do not ask for every detail on every peripheral thing. Even the central story can have gaps, but these gaps should be crossable with careful academic analysis. A serious lore hunter should be able to reconstruct a central canon beyond a reasonable doubt. I really hope that you collaborate with a professional writer and co-write the story, rather than taking a writer's backstory, changing it according to your own vision, and potentially messing it up. Up to this point, I do not see you an excellent writer or story builder. Despite the harsh reviews presented in this video, I love Elden Ring. It is easily the #1 game for me. The gameplay is just too good. The art design is top-notch. The map is big. The potential story is fascinating. I will continue to play it hard. I love Miyazaki and his games. Therefore, I have high hopes that he continues to struggle unto eternity, creating more excellent games like Elden Ring. Miyazaki-san is a shining star. Without you in Elden Ring, I could have never learned Japanese. I could have never learned how to analyze in-game files. I could have never spent so much time analyzing scattered information, even carefully examining the choice of words and syntax of sentences. I could have never learned how to make a video. Also, I deeply appreciate your philosophical views, reflected in your games. I can sense the depth of your thoughts, and you indeed inspired me to think a lot. Simply put, Miyazaki is a savior for my pathetic life.
May the gleaming star guide me evermore.